The cause of food sensitivities is a couple-fold. There's two primary causes. What's going on with stress chemistry and nervous system, because that's informing the immune system. There's a beautiful schematic from Dr. I think Samuel Yannick. He's an immunologist. And I saw it for the first time and I thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly how I practice. And it's like just shows all the things flowing into inflammation, how it impacts innate immunity in the gut, and how T1 and Th1 and Th2 balance get out of balance, and what kind of symptoms they present. Are they like an allergic style type symptom? Are they this other type of symptom?
Hey there, and welcome back to the Reshape Your Health podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Morgan Nolte, and today's conversation is going to be the perfect follow-up to last week's conversation about SIBO with Dr. William Davis. Today, I have Christa Biegler. She's a registered dietitian, an author, podcast host, and private practice owner, helping health-savvy women overcome food sensitivities and fatigue without restrictive dieting to beat bloat, burnout, and eczema breakouts. She has a passion for self-clinical thyroid issues, the nervous system, and stealth biotoxins. She lives with her unicycling husband and kids in the Midwest. Christa, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And we were just chatting. We actually probably have more in common than we ever know because we're in bordering states, which we got a small Midwesterners have to stick together.
We really do. And this conversation is going to be a great follow-up from last week's. I hope that the listeners listen to the last week's conversation. If you haven't, you don't necessarily need to listen to that one first. You can just stay right here and then go back and listen to that. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about SIBO, so small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIFO, which is a fungal overgrowth, food sensitivities, because after I interviewed Dr. William Davis, I have been devouring his book all week long. Gut health is kind of a newer area of study for me. I focused a lot on insulin resistance, but now I'm learning a little bit more about gut health and how poor gut health can lead to inflammation, right? And inflammation can contribute to insulin resistance. So now I care about gut health quite a bit. And I'm exploring it in my own life and kind of experimenting with different recipes. And I think it's fun to learn new stuff. So I hope the audience really appreciates the conversation today. And we want to give you a lot of clinical pearls from today's conversation. Christa has a ton of clinical experience. She's helped a lot of women with the bloat, the eczema, gut issues. And so my hope is that we can dive into some more nuanced conversations about that will resonate with people who have really been struggling with some gut issues for a while. So
Perfect.
firstly, can you talk about like food sensitivities? Because I think more and more and more we're hearing about food sensitivities or food intolerances or food allergies. And let's just start with the basics. How do you differentiate a sensitivity from an intolerance from an allergy?
Great question. And this is usually where a lot of people start when they start considering other things. And I'm a dietitian by background, so of course I started in food until it became not quite enough, or you can chase all these different diets. But let's answer your question first, which is differentiating between allergies, intolerances, and sensitivities. So I'll start with the easiest, what we agree on. And what we agree on is that allergies are IgE mediated reactions, immunoglobulin E. So those we typically think about as an immediate reaction. They actually can be a little delayed as well, but usually we're going to, just for point of conversation or for ease, usually a more immediate reaction. It may be anything from coughing to vomiting to what you think of from anaphylaxis. It might be tongue swelling, throat closing. That would be pretty severe, but people may sometimes just get a rash from that. So that's an allergy. And there is a little nuance here where we think that these are permanent, but we know in children for sure that a lot of people outgrow them by age 3 or 5. And that has a lot to do with what's going on in the immune system. And the immune system lives in the gut. So the better that the gut is, the more likely you might outgrow that is a possibility. So that's IgE reactions. We think that they're permanent, but we've also seen that that's not always the case. And I will say that I'll just mention this because something that can happen that we might get into later is when the whole body burden or the inflammatory load is just off the charts, when the whole bucket's full and overflowing. People may go in and get an allergy test and they will say, I lit up like a Christmas tree. And
Mm-hmm.
that's just not normal. That is just a ton of inflammation and it needs to be redone. When I was digging into the research around allergies also, I would I welcome any challenge to this, but this is kind of what I go with. Environmental allergies might be better suited by looking at skin prick testing, and food allergies might be better by blood. You will not always find that that's the case. The gold standards are really when you do both and or oral tolerance. And who was I? I was talking to a client from either Canada or Europe, and I don't remember which country, but she just said in their country, the standard, it was Canada, is oral tolerance. So they literally find out that the child is allergic and try to do oral tolerance. That just means let me put this food in their mouth in the clinic, and
Yeah.
see if they react and see what the reaction is. And so it can vary quite a bit, that IgE reaction, but we generally have a standard of care universally. And so that's what we agree about most. From there, it gets a little fuzzy. We kind of agree about intolerance, and the easiest way to consider intolerance, and I think intolerance and sensitivity get interchanged a little bit, but there's some real authorities on this topic, and I'm going to go by the authorities. So, intolerance is technically a digestive incapacity, inadequacy. So, the most common one being lactose intolerance, right? Like you are not producing enough lactase, the enzyme to break down lactose, the milk sugar, so therefore you get a stomach ache. So that's the most common thing in intolerance. And so I'm not going to interchange intolerance and sensitivity. A sensitivity, we were talking about IgE reactions and allergies. A sensitivity is all the other possible reactions. We do not unanimously agree about this universally, like across the world, across the medical professions, unfortunately, but we kind of do. So I'll give you a little caveat first. Celiac is its own thing, right? I don't think it really fits in any of these categories technically, but what happens in celiac at the basic is that a little bit of gluten can flatten the villi in the gut. And so that's a problem because that's a lot of nutrient absorption, etc. But there's also people who have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So
Mhm.
they're like, well, you did not test positive for celiac, but we can see that you have a sensitivity to this particular protein. So you have non celiac gluten sensitivity. So we've just literally defined a sensitivity, yet we do not necessarily agree about it unanimously. So don't go to your doctor and expect all of us to speak the same language. And that's just because not everyone speaks the same language about it because there isn't a universal language yet. And so with a sensitivity, it is all of the other immune mediated reactions, IgM, T cells, IgG, et cetera. And a lot of testing in the market is just looking at IgG. There is some testing that looks at all endpoint mediators, which I always say, like with the Nerf guns, if you have these different Nerf guns and they're shooting different color bullets, like one is IgGs and one is IgMs and one is T cells and all these things. And then there's a couple tests on the market that look at the endpoint Nerf bullets. And let me cut to the chase here. This is all fine and dandy, and humans love immediate response, right? It's like, I love when I do a thing and I see a result. It is very human. We love it. And my practice started that way. I was a contractor, worked in different areas of clinical, and then somewhere around 2015, I went into private practice and I started with food sensitivities. It was super fun because it was like, whoa, immediate results. The reality with food sensitivities, when you're changing your diet, you really should see differences in 10 to 14 days, so up to 3 weeks at most. That's actually like cardinal rule mistake number one, I think, is that people restrict their diet too long without really changes. And it's like you should have seen the change you needed to see typically. The
Mhm.
the symptoms that respond the slowest are pain mediated symptoms. So headaches and like total systemic pain, like that is going to be the soonest they're going to see it changes, like 3 to 4 weeks. But other people like digestive, it's like immediate to 10 to 14 days. And that's because of half-life of certain blood cells. So that was all fine and dandy. It was super fun. I'm an achiever by nature. I'm an Enneagram 3. We love results. So it's very much a dopamine hit when my clients were like dramatically improving their symptoms. And people are somewhat familiar with changing their diet to manage symptoms or to manipulate symptoms because that's kind of the content of a zillion books written by lots of health providers. It's very simple to do. It's like there's all these different diets out there, right? Where you can manipulate your diet and you may or may not see a change. Guess who I see in my practice? The people who tried those things and either it worked to an extent or they relapsed from it or it didn't work. And those are the people I see. Or this is an important area that I just have like a huge heart for. One of the reasons I stopped doing that type of work is not because it wasn't necessarily effective, but it's funny. They always say like God will give you what you can handle at that time. And so it was like it started and it was perfect. Like I didn't have any roadblocks. And then my husband was the first person I ran this procedure test protocol. Like there's some specifics around how you can do this the right and the wrong way. I have lots of feelings about that. We don't have to go into that though, because I know we have a lot of other better suited things for our time. And he was the first person who didn't get results, and that was annoying for lots of
Mm.
reasons. That's a whole different conversation with families, right?
Uh-huh.
But then I had a couple more roadblocks. And so what do we do in practice if we want to achieve, like everyone wants to help their people, right? And so then you just keep adding tools to the toolbox. Before I knew it, as I added other tools, I didn't really need to restrict people's diets. And one of the negative fallouts was that people over restricted for too long, or they created and developed food fear. I also have strong feelings about not doing this for a long time with children, especially certain age children. I think we create much more harm than good.
Mm.
So I almost don't change my clients' diets anymore, which is hilarious as a dietitian. But that's because the philosophy here in this practice is that whole food is the best food is best. And like it's like we're 80-20 or 90-10 principle people. So
Mm.
it's my real desire is I want you to enjoy life. Because what happens sometimes, and this is like my favorite person, is they have been restricting for whatever reason. There's lots of colors of that reason. And they're like, this sucks. I don't want to do this anymore. It seemed fine at the beginning. It was like, I can do this for a while. But our human nature is that we get burned out by stuff. And the reality is, if you restrict your diet in too many ways for too long, you will create other problems.
Mhm.
I have created all kinds of problems in myself. So fun. Like you, from restricting your diet, you're sending signals sometimes of like lack of safety.
Mm.
There's a whole bunch of things here. And then what happens is the downstream effect, the adrenals take sometimes the brunt of it. And I remember after restricting my diet, I made everything worse. I was having a severe eczema breakout in like 2016, probably related to all the stress from everything going on.
Yeah.
Having two young kids, starting a new business, all the things. I was excited to implement this process in myself as we are. We're like, oh, I want to get a test done. I want to see what I should do. And then I got it. And so many people have had this thing. They're like, I love these foods. I do not want to give up these foods. So I went through the protocol. But within 2 weeks, I'd actually made everything worse. So I remember reaching into a bag of pecans, putting them in my mouth, and like my eye instantly started swelling. And I knew at that point I'd like made a mess out of things. So good times. I
Yeah.
always say one of the best things, whether it's good or bad, is that I've had a lot of the same problems my clients have. So that's the exciting part because then you're able to have quite a bit of empathy. And that's how we arrive at the place we arrive at, right? But at the end of the day, I was sick of restricting diets. I wanted people to have a healthy diet, but like constant restriction is just honestly exhausting.
It's
So,
exhausting. Yeah, and
yeah,
I
I
think that
got
a
out of
lot
it.
of people can relate to what you just said, where they might be experiencing some digestive issues or bloating, or just they're not tolerating a food very well. And they're like, maybe I should get some food sensitivity done. And then they get the test. Yeah, they light up like a Christmas tree, and then they feel like they have to cut everything out of their diet. However, I want you to talk to some of the efficacy of the IgG testing, because that's what a lot of these kind of like mail-in tests are, and they do. So can you speak to the efficacy of that? And, can we really trust those results on IgG testing?
Yeah. Well, all of this is a moving target. So depending on
Okay.
what's going on in the gut, it's so if you've got, for example, if you've got gut permeability, it's going to just change with whatever you're eating at that time, which is why
Mm.
often people will look at that and say, like, oh, I eat these things all the time. Yeah, it's because your gut
Yes.
is permeable.
Yep,
and,
yep.
and it's just like the thing that's leaking through the other side right now. And that's what's showing up and it will change. And to go back to the Nerf bullet conversation, if you are just looking at the inflammatory bullets that are red, let's pretend those are the IgGs, but you are not looking at the greens or the yellows, then you might get some benefit by reducing that much inflammation. I find it's most useful with like more severe, like if people have significant gut issues. But all that to say, the whole question is like, it's a fine question, but what if you could just skip over that part? That's what I do
Right.
now.
I'm like, is it the right question? Because I think I
No.
love the quote, the quality of your life is determined by the quality of the questions. And instead of maybe asking questions, well, what foods am I sensitive to? Maybe a better question is, why am I sensitive to any foods in the first place? And so let's kind of go down that pathway
Yes.
more.
Yeah.
Why are people so like, why do they have issues with food sensitivities in the first place?
Yeah, the root of the root. And guess what? It
Mhm.
just keeps going. We're just a bunch of onions. We just unlayer
Yeah.
ourselves endlessly. The cause of food sensitivities is a couple fold. There's two primary causes. What's going on with stress chemistry and nervous system, because that's informing the immune system. There's a beautiful schematic from Dr. I think Samuel Yannick. He's an immunologist. And I saw it for the first time and I thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly how I practice. And it's like just shows all the things flowing into inflammation, how it impacts innate immunity in the gut, and how T1 and TH1 and TH2 balance get out of balance, and what kind of symptoms they present. Are they like an allergic style type symptom? Are they this other type of symptom? All of that to say, so there's two huge things that influence that. So nervous system, stress chemistry, and we can talk about that in a respective relapse. And the longer someone's been dealing with someone, the bigger that stuff becomes. And the other one is essentially digestion and dysbiosis, or imbalances in the gut. And so I always say, like, please put on my headstone, no one was digesting properly. As evidenced
Yes.
by, have you ever gotten gas after you ate? That's poor digestion typically, right? And you might just not be digesting that thing, right? Especially if you're used to eating XYZ foods at home and then you go out and eat XYZ Frankenstein food out, you may not
Yep.
digest it beautifully and you might get gas. So if you have gas, and I love talking about like SIBO in this context, if you have gas or bloating 0 to 2 hours after you eat, that's small intestine bacterial overgrowth, because the transit time of the small intestine is supposed to be 2 hours. So if you're having gas and bloating within 2 hours, well, then you can make an assumption that you've already got an issue in that area. But that's not quite enough. We've got to kind of look at the overall holistic, we got to look at the digestive system from like the front to the back, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I mentioned that little, snippet of SIBO because with SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is what last week's episode was about for you, that's cool. It's cool that we are now giving lip service conventionally and we can recognize SIBO. So you can go to your doctor, and if they don't know what SIBO is, they're just living in the Stone Age at this point because it's been around for at least 10, 20 years for sure. Like it's become more normal. And you and I are in the Midwest, so we both know that we get things last.
Or just to live in the coast, like fashion,
Exactly.
information, all the
hmm
opinions, all the things. Yeah.
Exactly. So, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is essentially the imbalance of a couple of bacteria. And to me, the relapse rate when people get treated. So we've got, I don't know if this is exactly the standard of care, and I don't fully care, but a very common thing people get, they would get rifaximin, which was an antibiotic that was supposed to be just
Yep.
targeting small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. That's super cool. But have you ever looked up what the relapse is on SIBO? It's like 60%, which tells, I mean, that's not good. So that means that we're missing more root causes. So all you have to do is look up and down on both sides of the small intestine. So up, we've got upper GI stuff. So literally, how fast are we chewing? Are we even secreting digestive enzymes? Did you know that when you have stress, the first thing to go is your stomach acid? And then once
No,
your
I did
stomach
not
acid is
know that.
depleted, all your other enzymes get downregulated as well. It's a very nutrient dependent process, and it's a huge piece of relapse, actually. Stomach acid being kind of the gate. I always like to use this analogy of like, remember when they would leave the pizza out all night at the party and then people would just like come by and eat it hours later? Or like, I don't know. I just had a husband that this definitely happened at his house, in college. Like it's like you cook the pizza, it sat out all night, and then these boys just walked by and ate it, and they were fine. That's
Yeah.
stomach acid. Like logically, we know that crap can grow on food that sits out for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Not kept at a proper temperature. Technically, we learned this in school and life and common sense. But they come along and eat it. And in theory, stomach acid is the answer there because it's kind of the gate. So the crap doesn't get out or in on either side, right? The cows don't get in or out on the other side. And so this is the bacteria. So if you have bacteria coming in, not getting bathed in that acid, and by the way, that acid helps break down proteins, which are incredibly useful for every freaking other thing to happen. Let's just talk about why you might care that you break down protein. So if someone is listening to this and protein sits like a rock in their gut, hey, there's so much you could do about that. If you're not digesting protein, you're not getting amino acids, which are the building blocks of skin for healing, phase 2 detoxification, and also your neurotransmitters and your mood. This is why sometimes you see, like, there's plenty of people out there that will talk to you about plant-based diets. If they do them for a very long time, sometimes their mood starts to change a few years later. So fun stories about that. But anyway, there's always options to make things better. Anyway, so stomach acid gets depleted. It's a very nutrient dependent process, energy dependent process. And then stress also shuts down other enzyme function. So at the very beginning of time, we're not digesting, and undigested things feed bad bacteria and fungus and everything else. And then it's a self-feeding loop. Like once you feed it, it's taking your nutrients first, and then it's an organism on its own. So it's eating that and giving off waste. And so that waste that it gives off might look like fatigue after eating or brain fog after eating, right? Like you may need a nap. It might look like in my career, I see a lot of skin issues. it might look like a whole host of things. It could look like GI distress. That's the tricky part with gut health, is that it's so commonly discussed. At least the people who land in my practice kind of already know the gut's important, or that it's like kind of the centerpiece to things. But that said, it's always easier if there's some gut issue. So let me talk briefly about what's normal. What's normal is to have a bowel movement that's like a banana 1 to 3 times a day. And plenty of people don't have that experience. And so that's like kind of, you know, just gold standard 101, even better in the morning, typically. And so sometimes people can have, absence of gut symptoms, but there's still gut imbalances. They might just be showing up as something else. They might just look like, honestly, I mean, just name a symptom and I could draw a line to exactly how it happens. So upstream, we're talking about digesting, like literally chewing our food, secreting digestive enzymes, etc. There are some upper GI bacteria that can really impair stomach acid as well, that can, if there's any heartburn, reflux, and digestion, all of that upper GI needs to be tended to. There's an issue there. And you'll usually see, I don't know the numbers, but it's a good question. If you've been diagnosed with SIBO, it's like, well, what else do you have going on as well? Is there any burping, reflux, and digestion? And then downstream, what's going on? So we have a small intestine, but we have a large intestine. The large intestine is a way cooler party. There's a lot going on down there. So when you do large intestine testing, there is usually a lot of bacteria to look at. Sometimes there's fungus, sometimes there's parasites. No, I want to make sure I'm really clear. Like, no test is perfect. So don't think you're going to go order a test and it's just going to solve all your problems. That doesn't usually work. And people will hear this and still go do that. And that's fine. Cool. Great. Fantastic. The consumer testing market is improving. But I always say, like, what are you going to do with the information? That's always useful too, right? And that's okay. We're all going through different phases. So sometimes we're just like in the information collecting phase and we're just trying to find some kind of answer. So, but downstream is important, and there's a lot more bacteria going on and different things that can be going on. And with SIBO testing, it seems really inadequate to me. It's like, I can see why we universally agree about it, because it's so simple. It's like, oh, just measuring a couple things like high or low or whatnot. Whereas with large intestine, you're going to probably see it is going to be pretty transient. I will say that, like, depending on what's going on that day, that week, that month for you, the bacteria will change. What you're eating will change that bacteria, but you're just getting a snapshot. Certain stool tests, you do actually take multiple samples, which I think is a little more ideal if possible, but it's not perfect. And then what you do with that information, what it shows you, is important. I like to, I think I'll just mention this here because I always kind of hesitate. I love to talk about testing, but then I also hesitate because sometimes you can talk about it to an extent and then people go order things and it's like, well, what am I supposed to do with this? I'm like, I understand. And there is processes to this. And so I like to balance symptoms next to testing pretty equally. That's not completely true. I think symptoms are more important than testing at the end, right? I think testing is a validation tool for the clients. After I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of tests, I'm kind of like, sure, I could have guessed this. Sometimes they're really cool and they're like, ooh, good thing you got this done. There's all kinds of really interesting stuff here. Everyone loves a test that tells them exactly what to do, but that's not always the case. And so I like people to know there's plenty of people who don't really know how to read stool testing or read between the lines, or are not reading clinical clues or symptoms as well as they should. They're putting more faith in the test than and I'm saying this out loud for the clinician and the client, right? I'm saying this out loud because if you've made this mistake before, take note. Let's stop making that mistake accidentally, right? Like, I know it's cliche to say treat the person, not the test, but let's make sure we're doing it, right? That's important.
So let's say someone comes to your practice and they're having those symptoms of SIBO. Maybe they're having like the bloating within 2 hours after a meal, or like they just feel like something's off 2 hours after eating. Are you going to test for SIBO, or do you just move right to the treatment based on their symptoms?
Yeah. I mean, you could do either. I
Okay.
actually use a functional stool test. So I'm looking at the large intestinal health. There are times I could skip that. I just had someone who, spilled the reagent that goes in the little tube. And so, normally I'd like to get her started. And so I just chose like, oh, we're just going to start because we know that there's all these other things going on. And so we can just get started with treatment. And she also had just been on antibiotics, which affects everything. So generally, it's easy to start with a stool test because then you can go over that with people. It can kind of give them a picture of what's going on inside of them. And by the time people get to your office, I mean, just again, human perspective of all of this, they'd like to see some validation. Like, let me give you an
Mhm.
example. All of my clients with skin issues and eczema, I think 100% of them have an overgrowth of staph and strep. Do I really need to test to look at that for myself anymore? No, not really. But for them, it's really nice to say, like, "Whoa, that's pretty overgrown." And sometimes I get like a kid test. I will say, like, children's bowel tests seem to be more honest. With adults,
Mm.
there is some things, there's history, right? And so my fingers are the villi in the intestines. And so
Yeah.
between the villi can be this garbage, these things that can get kind of stuck in there. And then we can have these little plaques and things that kind of develop. And so if you got a
Mm.
little stool floating through, right? Floating might not be the right word, but just being contracted through, essentially, it's kind of like just a picture in time. And so I do test.
Mm.
I do test knowing that there are faults to the testing. And then I'm always asking really pointed questions, because to see fungus in shed out in the stool is not necessarily always going to be the case. So I'm always assessing for fungal questions in other parts of the body, because it can be hanging out in the sinuses. Super common. It
Mhm.
can be hanging out lots of different places. It can hang out in the vaginal microbiome. And I'm also going to ask questions related to just other organisms that can be going on. Like parasites don't really show up on stool tests super commonly, but sometimes they do. And then certain stool tests. One of the coolest stool tests I've ever seen was actually I don't know exactly, it was very similar to the one I used, but it was out of Australia, and they actually did a much better job testing for parasites. Now, all of that said, just again, like caveating all of this, if you go into your medical doctor in a normal setting, right? Like just schedule an appointment, want to get a stool test. Usually, stool tests are typically reserved for infectious disease or diagnostics around irritable bowel disease, to be honest. And usually, you're not going to have things show up in a conventional stool test unless you have an acute issue. So, for example, maybe you know the story. Like, we both live in the Midwest where there's like farmers and ranchers. I every once in a while have someone who calls me and says, "What's wrong? I This person has had diarrhea for a week," and I'm like, that is when you go take them in and have them run a stool test, because it's probably going to show Campylobacter, right, from working cattle or like getting that in their
Mhm.
mouth when they were working cows or something. So, so being really
Right.
real conversation there. So if it's an acute situation or they just did travel and they came home and like everything's a disaster,
Mhm.
it's great to go into infectious disease. After that, once it gets kind of chronic and long term, I would say like this stuff does not show up. Rh pylori testing is also like super inadequate conventionally. It does not show up. Um,
Yep.
and I saw that when I was working in practice in very significant medical settings. It's like people be so symptomatic, get treated a bunch, maybe a little bit better, but then right back where they started. So, SIBO is not the only problem where it's like, man, people end up right back where they started. And that's why it's so important to like talk the whole way down. And so if people ask me these like very innocent questions, like, hey, how could I address this? Or I have this going on, I'm like, bloating and gas, and which are all symptoms of SIBO, or large bowel dysbiosis, there's more than just one thing that has to be done if you really want to
Mhm.
resolve. You've got to tend to your digestion the entire way through. And these organisms, the main issue is that there's an imbalance then in organisms, and then they thrive on the undigested stuff or not digesting it very well. And then you
Mm.
can have bacterial overgrowth and fungal overgrowth. And all of that ends up stealing your nutrients, which contributes to not having the energy you want to have. It contributes to symptoms you don't really want to have. It can, increase prevalence of illness. I mean, it's just like sky's the limit on the
Well,
particular symptoms that can
and
be
people
happening.
reply like, "Well, what the heck is she saying?" When it can end up like, in the sinuses and the genitals and stuff, the skin. It's like, how can digestive issues be so widespread? So can you explain that a little bit more?
Totally. So I was speaking specifically about fungus. And so if we back up big picture, we have a microbiome, our bacteria. It is not, it's not only on our gut, it's on our skin, it's in our entire body, right? We also have so we know that, like that's very commonly accepted. If you don't know it now, you do, right? So I forgot. It's like we have pounds of bacteria on in and around us. We share bacteria with the people we live with. Some interesting study was someone in the home was on antibiotics, and they tested the microbiome of everyone in the household. And for I don't know if I remember if the study was 4 or 6 weeks. So the antibiotic course, who knows how long it was, like 3 to 10 days. And but the microbiomes of everyone in the house was affected for weeks afterwards
That's
until the study
crazy.
changed, right? And these people were not really like
Wow.
romantically involved, all of them. It's just like that's
Mhm.
like there's a lot we don't like. We're very affected by our surroundings that seem invisible. So that's the microbiome, microbiome. There's also the mycobiome, mycobiome. And that's your fungal biome or fungal colonies. And so fungus is normal, it's commensal, but it can be overgrown and it can be everywhere. So you can have fungal colonies that come into the sinuses and colonize in the sinus cavities, causing chronic sinusitis. I just mean chronic nasal congestion. You can touch fungus. You can be doing something with get an exposure to mold, which is just an aggressive fungus. And by the way, that's the exact same way people get sinus colonies because mold is
Mm.
literally everywhere. And so some people are just more reactive than others, especially if they had exposures as when they were younger. I'm having a mold conversation with half of my clients at least because it's just common. It's just really common. I don't necessarily lead with that conversation, but this has been people have been dancing around this topic for a, a 1 or 2 decades because the entire early 2000s and beyond, everyone was talking about candida. And I don't know, maybe you heard of candida diets, people restricting sugar. Or they could have just had fungal exposure from anywhere, right? Mold is simply just a more aggressive fungus. Some common thing that even my clients ask me is they will say, like, what's the difference between candida and mold? I'm like, candida is a specific strain of a fungus, but it's had a name for so long in our culture that people kind of are familiar with it. Whereas mold a has lots of fungal strains, right? Like it can be a ton of them, and they can affect your brain with causing insane brain fog, gliotoxin. There are mold that are nephrotoxic. I've had people that have kidney issues from them. And sometimes you just literally have like ongoing sinuses, or you had an increase of allergies as you got older, or you just had a rash and you never had a rash before, right? Those are all
Yeah.
really common situations. Why? It's not just fungus, it's just a nasty fungus. So it gives off a lot of toxins, endotoxins, biotoxins. And so all bacteria, by the way, gives off waste, right? Those are called endotoxins. And so when
Right.
your body's handling all those endotoxins, that's why it looks like brain fog. It looks like a skin rash. It looks like just pick your poison. I don't care what it is. And that's the annoying part, is that it can look a little different in different people. That's our unique profiles. So, people can
So there's
all be living
like
together.
the bacteria you said, I didn't want to skip over this part. I kind of want to go here next. The bacteria produce toxins. Is that like when they break down or when they
When
are
they're being fed. So it's just like they're a living organism. So just like us, we consume and give off waste, right? So they are
okay?
doing the same. So,
So the toxins they give off is like when they eat what we eat or
mhm,
maybe some fiber or whatever we're eating or
mhm.
undigested food, then they give off toxins.
Yes.
And so can those get into the bloodstream and then travel to different parts of the body
Mhm.
and kind of cause some issues, some inflammation in the parts of the body
Absolutely.
where
Absolutely.
bacteria, fungi, they're not supposed to be essentially?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So
There's
that I
the
think is an important point to note is like you can eat something and it can end up somewhere else. The toxins from the bacteria in your gut can end up in a completely different part of your
mhm.
body, but it could be traced back to poor gut health.
Yes, and it can show up. If it's GI mediated, it's usually gonna be 0 to 24 hours. If it's pain mediated, that's always more latent. That can be up to 3 days later. Typically, you'll see those reactions sometimes showing up.
Yeah, and so GI meaning like the gas, the bloating, the diarrhea, but the pain being like you have a migraine or you have some joint pain
Mhm.
or stuff like that.
Totally. It can be
Okay.
immediate, but it can be up to 3 days later, for
Okay.
sure.
Oh, go
And
ahead.
since I work with a lot of skin stuff, skin is so delayed too. It can be, so it can be
Mhm.
instant. Someone can have like an irritation, they can have a rash, and it can also be delayed. And an example that I teach my clients a lot, guess how I figured it out myself, and then seeing it in my clients, is you can get a cold. So that's going to be overgrowth of bacteria. We can agree about that, right? I can get this common head cold, overgrowth of bacteria, and then I can get better, but I can still have this little latent overgrowth. Like it's still just a little bit left over there, but it's not
Mhm.
enough to like really make you qualify yourself as sick. And that little overgrowth is going to go downstream. And so it's still going to have a little bit of endotoxin or like toxin byproduct. And so that can show up on your skin immediately or up to 3 weeks later. So, very common place people start to have a skin rash even after resolving them is getting sick and then seeing a flare. I see it all the time. And that's something I look for, especially with like
Interesting.
child histories. Yeah.
Right.
Or people go on antibiotics. When you go on antibiotics, you kill all the grass and the weeds. I honestly think we're honestly just a mirror of nature, not shockingly, right?
Yeah.
So I like to use a lawn as a good analogy point all the time. We understand it. So we kill all the grass and the weeds, and very commonly weeds grow back. We know that. The FDA said years ago we need to stop using antibiotics unnecessarily.
I'm
Driving
hearing this all the
antimicrobial
time, and
resilience.
oh, it could be bacterial, it could be viral, but here's an antibiotic just in case.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be more selective because I had a guest on here that said how long it can take your microbiome to
Years.
recover after like one course of antibiotics. Yeah, it's like years.
Mm-hmm.
And my question to you is, let's say someone has had a round of antibiotics and they know they have some gut issues. Like, what would you recommend to help restore their gut health after a round of antibiotics?
Um, So usually in the research, if people are doing probiotics during or post antibiotic, it's about the same whether they're doing it during or just post. I hope that made sense. So what I mean is the easiest thing is to do probiotics post antibiotics. That's something we can kind of say like, oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
There's nuance to that, but I don't worry too much about it. Do something. And then feed it with good fiber, because that's a main thing with probiotics is that there's a lot of different strains. Some of them aren't super resilient, and so feeding that with good fiber can be really important. So you could do fermented foods in that particular case. I use certain types of probiotics. And maybe you could or you couldn't go wrong. Just do something.
Yeah.
Something is better than nothing. But probiotics, fermented foods, fibers, post antibiotics would all be really useful.
And I think like fermented food with live cultures, because I
Hmm.
think that's something I learned from Dr. Davis's book is like the yogurt in the grocery store isn't really always fermented for very long. So there might not be a ton of probiotics in that food.
Hmm.
Or like he had a really good thing about pickles that are in clear liquids usually do not have a lot of benefits to them because you're not getting like those live bacteria. You're kind of getting like a sanitized pickle, I guess. And so I think I'm just learning. I told you
Hmm.
offline, like this is a new area of study for me. I'm learning, but I've really enjoyed making my own yogurt with like certain strains of bacteria that
Hmm.
have been kind of lost or really depleted in the human microbiome. With our latest onslaughts of lifestyle and stress and processed foods and antibiotics and all the things that harm our gut health. So I wanted to also something else I'm learning about is prebiotic fiber, because
Hmm.
when you say like eat fiber, and I myself too was like, okay, fiber is great for the gut, but there are certain types of fiber that are better for the gut than others. Can you talk about that?
Yes, but before I do, I want to say that I've gone to microbiome conferences, I've sat with other clinicians, and the thought process around prebiotics is that they're supposed to feed good bacteria. But we agree in practice, we see that they also feed bad bacteria. And
Mm.
so, for example, let me give you a very obvious example. Garlic and onions could be considered very good prebiotic fibers. But if someone has SIBO, those are the first things to come out of the SIBO diet, right? Like, I actually have like
Right.
a really short list. So, no matter what in gut health, there's a little bit of nuance. Like, you
Hmm.
can try to just be very supportive and do a lot of prebiotics, but if it makes things worse, it might be just because there's so much dysbiosis and bacterial overgrowth, etc. Like, I don't really believe in people starving out the bacteria and fungus personally. Maybe it's because I'm jaded because the people I see have done that and they're like not okay. and
Yeah.
so and so maybe I'm just having that filter or that lens, and so I'm like, yeah, this doesn't really work, guys. So I like to correct major imbalances, but again, my audience may be a little different than someone who just wants to experiment for the first time. So please experiment on your own at the first time, just to be clear. Like, again,
But if you have
there's
onions
ways.
and garlic, because they're prebiotic fiber and it makes it worse, like don't
Mhm.
get discouraged. It's kind of part of the learning
Yeah,
process.
yeah, it's part of the learning process, and it's not the end of the world. And for some people, it's much worse than others. And what's really funny is that one of the bacteria that gets overgrown in SIBO is methane bacteria. And something that really works to treat methane bacteria is an extract from garlic called allicin. Isn't that
Hmm.
interesting? The thing
Hmm.
that provokes it also is the treatment to an extent, right?
Yeah.
So there's always another layer there. So I tell you that it's ultimately meant to be useful and helpful. Like, don't be discouraged. Like, just collect your data, take notes of things, right? Because and sometimes the first time you're going through a project, if you run into some things, if you've never run into those challenges before, you might not know how to overcome them, but there might be someone you could ask that actually knows the answer to that, where it's like, yeah, obviously it's bacterial overgrowth. That methane is feeding on the whole complex of that. But when you take an extract out, it's actually the
Mm,
treatment for it. Kind of cool.
it's interesting.
It is interesting. So talking about prebiotic fibers, I usually use those post treating any imbalances, technically, but prebiotic fibers can be lots of things. They can be things like inulin, they can be things like glucomannan, they can be things like acacia fiber. Literally like ground, some of my favorite fibers like have ground chia seeds in them, some of the ones I've just mentioned, which you don't really find massively in nature. Some of those, like glucomannan, the main food source of that I could find was like those miracle noodles of like yesteryear, if you know what I'm
Mm.
talking about. They like
Oh,
smell disgusting. They were like huge in the low carb era. They were like made out of this interesting starch, where they had like very little carbs. So those are prebiotic fibers. There's many others on the market, and I don't get too wrapped up in it. I don't need to get too
what
wrapped up
food
into it.
sources?
What was that?
Like food sources, like real food
Yeah.
sources, because those are the specific like fiber types. But if people are like,
Hmm.
okay, well, what food should I eat to support my gut
Yes.
health? What would you say?
Yes. So one thing I think is really cool is resistant starch. And resistant starch is massively increased like if you cook a starch like rice and then you refrigerate it. So it massively increases that resistant starch. And that can be really beneficial over time. Other common food-based sources of prebiotics are less ripe bananas, onions, artichokes, etc. But to be honest, don't overthink this, in my opinion. Literally go buy what's on sale at the grocery store throughout the season instead of having your grocery list on autopilot. Because if you just, because polyphenols are really good prebiotic fibers, and polyphenols are a variety of an antioxidant, I guess is the simplest way to say it, but they all act as prebiotic and they're really beneficial. So, literally using really fresh herbs and spices can be a huge deal. So, like, that's a huge thing for me. I spend more on my herbs and spices and it makes my food taste awesome. And my stuff is like, it's freeze dried herbs and spices. And so, those are so rich in those
Mm,
polyphenols, which are so nutritive. So, it's like, we don't have to overcomplicate this. And then I live in a food desert. So, that means like, I don't make a meal plan and it's like I'm going to be able to find this thing. There is a rotation of things I can find, but I go into the grocery store, I buy what is on sale, which is what's in season. Guess what? What's on sale is what's in season, typically.
mm,
And I have these different varieties of colors. And if you do that, if you shoot for different colors, if you shoot for different things, if in the winter you're going for like the winter squashes, etc., and in the summer you're going for all of those things in season at that time, your radishes and your arugula and all of those things, you're getting a double whammy. And so bitters from the food. So a lot of these foods have bitter properties. And the reason I am stopping to talk about that is as soon as arugula came out of my mouth, I was like, oh yes, bitters. Bitters are these are something we don't understand as much as we probably will in the future, but we have bitter receptors on all these different organs in our bodies, which is pretty cool,
mm,
which just tells us they do them more than we think. But bitters in foods stimulate your body to make its own enzymes. So if you can take in all these colorful plant foods, right? You're not only and digest them, you're not only getting the fibers from them and the polyphenols, you're also getting digestive bitters. So you've now just killed two birds with one stone, which is always the
yeah.
best thing.
So like the bitters increase the digestive enzymes, which helps the whole process.
Exactly. Because if you're
Um,
not digesting, then you don't have the fiber. Like if you just digest the fiber you're using, your body's got all these self healing processes actually too.
I've also heard of like beans, lentils, peas being good sources of prebiotic fiber. But cellulose is not, right? So cellulose is a type of fiber that passes through us
Yeah.
undigested.
So, what you're talking about is insoluble versus soluble fibers. And
Okay.
so, insoluble meaning, yes, just passing through, insoluble meaning you're actually processing the nutrients from them.
So like let's say I'm eating a bunch of celery, which has a ton of insoluble fiber, correct?
I think so.
Okay, kinda like the stringy stuff. I
Hmm.
think broccoli has a lot of insoluble fiber.
Hmm.
You're saying there's still polyphenols in the celery and in the broccoli
And
that
all
kinda
kinds
give
of
it
other nutrients too,
yeah,
right?
all kinds of other things, and that gives it its, like, green color, and that will still act as some prebiotic fiber. So it's not like you only have, if you're like super focused on gut health, I know how some people are, and they're like, I'm only going to have the best kinds of fiber. It's like, no, just
Yeah.
have a variety of
I
things.
think really when I hear stuff like that, I'm at the point in my career, I'm like, oh, what does this actually say about your personality? Which is actually the bigger issue
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
That you're such a perfectionist. That's actually the cause of your gut issues. Sorry. It's
I know.
not but to make light of this, if you people haven't consumed certain fibers very often, like beans are not always a really robust part of my diet because I ebb and flow
Mhm.
with things and I just don't care right now. And then some people are like, beans are the way.
Yeah.
And some people are anti-bean, and I really don't have a dog in this fight. I just do not eat a ton of beans. So if I do, and I get a little bit, so this is actually an amazing thing to qualify, because earlier we were talking about if you get gas and bloating from a food, of course
Yeah.
you have SIBO. But if you have these insoluble fibers or these fibers that you don't break down very commonly, your body is not adjusted to making those types of enzymes. And so any
Mm.
person who eats broccoli like once every never may end up with some gas and bloating. But if they were eating a lot more cruciferous vegetables a lot more often, your body would start to develop those enzymes and do a better job breaking those down. So
Mm.
there's two ways to look at that. And I would say keep pushing on that stuff.
What about erythritol? So when we're talking about gas and bloating, like I can tell you, anytime I have erythritol,
Yeah.
that will give me gas.
It's
So
not a benefit. I mean, it's not something you need. It's a sugar
no.
alcohol, right? So it's
Yeah.
like, in the sugar alcohol, we know the side effect is that it causes loose stool. So that's a sneaky, tricky thing. And that's like whitewashing health, right? Where it's like, there's no sugar in this, but it's actually full of sugar alcohol. So you're going to have diarrhea. So
Yes.
that's a tricky, sneaky thing just to be aware of, because sometimes we get on this rotation of like, I liked these cookies that are whitewashed with health labels on them. It's like, yeah, just be aware of the erythritol in there, right? Which is a sugar alcohol, which is your body may not digest beautifully, which may cause loose stool.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that I have SIBO just because I have gas
No,
after eating erythritol.
no, that's a great question and a good point. It's like, oh yeah, if you're eating like crap, you may not digest that, right? If you're eating a frankenfood, then you may not digest that beautifully, and that's okay.
Well, that's a really good point, because a lot of people are eating, frankenfood,
True.
processed food.
I know my
One of my
clients are like
clients,
healthy eaters, so then I forget to like
oh,
qualify some of that.
but it's true. It's crazy. Like, so you just look around the grocery
Hmm.
store, look around a game, and it's like there are so many people who are continuing to eat, you know, processed food and drink pop. And it's like we're kind of in our little bubble in this like online health space. And sometimes I
I like it
forget
in
that
my
the world
bubble.
at large, still eats a bunch of processed food.
Yeah, and
And
then
so that's normal to get gas and bloating after you're not eating real food, correct?
yeah, I mean, it can be, right? Because it's hard to, I always say that, like, if I, like, I just eat good food at my house, normal. Like, last night we had literally steak and potatoes and fresh picked asparagus. And it's like, that's fine, right? Some people, they'd be like, oh, it's not there. Everyone's got different normals. I thought that was very normal, whole foods. No gas and bloating to be had after eating
Yeah.
those things. Not an issue. But if I'm out, and I think where this comes up the most is if you're eating. For me, it's eating out. Like, I'm going
Yep.
to be exposed to things that are not normal food, so that's when I might support my digestion, just so I am digesting well. Because the
Yep.
longer I don't digest, like the longer I would let gas and bloating go unchecked, then the more it could contribute to a longer, bigger overgrowth, if that makes sense, right? Because if
Interesting.
stuff is undigested.
Yeah.
So you make a great point. I just have like a nutrition philosophy that I kind of like plaster all over. That's like, we're just agreeing that whole food is best when you walk in the
Yes.
door. And I'm not going to criticize your choices, but we can shift that way. It's sort of like having a whole foods diet is kind of elementary at this point. Not that everyone is or isn't doing it, but it's sort of like cool.
Everybody can agree on that, I
Yeah,
think.
everyone could agree on it. And it's like, do we it's more of, we have intelligent people that we just make different choices, and that's fine too. Like, it's not, we don't, I'm not going to criticize my clients that stopped at McDonald's for lunch. I don't really care. It's like,
Yeah.
that's fine. I understand what I'm doing, and that if that's, and I just remind them when I'm talking to them, like, I like to try to eat in accordance to how I want to feel, and so
Yep.
those are just like, it's like a value shift over time. So
Well, I have a question for you. You've brought up stomach acid a couple times, like supporting digestion. Does having apple cider vinegar help increase stomach acid? Or like what recommendations do you have for people that have low stomach acid?
Yeah, so let me back up a little bit. You could self-test for this. I actually used to teach on this a lot to clients, and I took it away for a while because I just did. And then I realized, oh yeah, if you do the self-experiment, it can be a very good helper in your own exploration of your own body. And so on an empty stomach, you can put a little baking soda in a little bit of water and drink that. And if you don't have any burping, so this is like sixth grade science where you mixed vinegar in with baking soda and you created a volcano once upon a time.
Mhm.
Hopefully, we all know what we're talking about. I don't know if this still happens in school, but at least the people listening to this, hopefully, we all know. So you're creating that, you're simulating something similar in your body. So you're creating the
Mhm.
ripe situation for having like a little bit of gas, bloating, burping, more so like burping or hiccups or anything like that by drinking a little bit of baking soda on an empty stomach. And we could criticize this experiment a little bit, but not too much. I think it's okay. So if there's no stomach acid for the baking soda to mix with, then you're not really going to have any of this burping, right? If it's just like crickets
Hmm.
down there, then you might not have amazing stomach acid. Most of my clients do not have amazing stomach acid. So you can replete stomach acid. There's a little nuance here. It can drive certain bacteria deeper into the tissue, but I do like to offer that is a possibility that doing like lemon juice or apple cider vinegar, those are options people can try. That's totally fine.
Yeah.
And I do think it's like cheap and easy. And since we're talking like 101, I forget about things. Apple cider vinegar does not mean white vinegar with caramel coloring. That is
Right.
how I don't know why that's sold. Like, what are we doing still in
Yeah.
this life? I learned that once upon a time and I forget that not everyone knows that. So since we're like making sure we're covering those bases, let's just remind ourselves of that. We're talking about apple cider vinegar with the mother, like Bragg's or another offshoot brand, essentially that's very similar to those.
So you want to see some like cloudy
Mhm.
stuff in it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, the
Yes.
unfiltered stuff.
Exactly.
Okay.
Perfect. Yes.
And so with that baking soda experiment, because I am more of the perfectionist side, how much baking soda should people try?
Yeah. I mean, this does not matter. Like a teaspoon and a little bit of
Just to
water.
see. Okay. I'm
Yeah.
like, well, I don't want people to
Or
like
half a
way
teaspoon.
overdo it and
True.
then
I
be
mean,
like
you make a good point. Like
super
I
burnt.
think this is like you probably measure in the kitchen and I just throw things in, right? And that's okay. I have to
No,
remember.
I don't measure.
Oh,
I throw
okay.
it in. My husband always, yeah, he's like, "Oh my gosh, what are you making this time?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I'm just
Yeah, just
throwing
making it
some
up.
stuff in."
I mean, half a
Um,
teaspoon as well,
okay,
is totally
love
fine.
it.
So,
I
yeah.
just didn't want people to like have a
It's such a
volcano.
good
It's
point. I
pretty
mean,
bad.
thank you for being the advocate for the person listening.
Yeah. That's
I
my
love it.
job.
Yeah.
That's my job. Okay. So the last thing I wanted to cover is relapses.
Mhm.
So if people are interested in healing their gut issues, there's a lot of resources out there. Krista's a great resource. The book I mentioned, Super Gut's a good resource. I'm learning a lot from that. But relapses are really common for
Mhm.
SIBO or other digestive problems. And like, why are they so common?
Mm. Well, first of all, the up and the downstream, for sure.
Okay.
And then what I work on with clients around relapse, again, because I had this small percentage of clients that did experience like they were like everything was good and then they would backslide and it was really annoying me. And guess what? I also had that happen, right? So I was like, well, this is annoying. Why is this happening? And so part of the upstream and the downstream and having stomach acid, this is built on nutrients and minerals. And this is where the physiology of stress and stress chemistry really comes in. When your cortisol is up, when your stress is up, you dump nutrients, you dump magnesium, you dump potassium, etc., and even sodium. And when you've dumped out these nutrients, these are the backbones to making a lot of other enzyme processes work.
Mm.
So the tricky part is you're not going to see this in blood typically. Like you are going to be so far gone if you see it in blood. Like it's going to be like you're going to feel like you're passing out, which I do have a client that has experienced that. And she was extremely restrictive for a very long time, sadly. And we're going to get her out of that, right? But she's in a very depleted place, right? Not everyone's going to have that case. Like most people, you're never going to see this on blood because your body is so protective of you. It's going to use up everything in the bank, the tissue, and it's just going to like manage with what it's got. It's going to like rob Peter to pay Paul all the time, and it's going to keep these electrolytes stable in the blood to keep your pH normal because then you don't die. Is essentially what your body is always like if you when we think about things, and I think this is really good because what I have noticed is when I stopped using the word bloating in my marketing, I stopped getting as many perfectionists. Well, and it's not necessarily that, but it's like there was a little different energy shift that happened. And so
Mm.
we do have a bit of a perfectionistic tendency. And I want to mention one other place where bloating can I'm off on a tangent, sorry. But bloating can be somewhat normal the week before your menstrual cycle also, right?
Yeah.
So we need to
Yes, I had
be,
that last
let's just like
like,
go ahead
really
and,
for
yeah, and there
sure.
can be times that we can improve it, but like in general, it's not unrealistic. It's okay.
Mm.
Like everything is going to be fine. But going back to relapse and nutrients and
Yeah.
minerals and just like our whole thing, because people are like, oh, I know that stress is important, but like, show me the proof. And so when these nutrients are depleted, a lot of processes do not work beautifully. So the adrenals may take the brunt of it, which can affect insulin resistance, right? Because adrenals produce lots of hormones, essential hormones being cortisol, but also DHEA. And so when people are like shaky more than a few hours between meals, if they can't go more than 2 to 3 hours between eating, like they probably got low DHEA. And if you got low DHEA, but your adrenals are not producing other hormones very well either because they've had long-term stress and they're depleted. And then stacking on top of that is thyroid, and that's kind of your metabolic rates. And this is like an area of interest to me because people have all the symptoms of thyroid, get their thyroid tested, and it's normal.
Mhm.
And that's perfect for me because I can show them how it's subclinically off by not having the nutrients that the thyroid needs. And one of the symptoms of sluggish thyroid is slow motility. So if you have slow motility, and just in general, if you have slow motility, like slow gastric emptying, because this is what you get told at the doctor sometimes, if you're not pooping, and you can do a self test on this too. You could like take some whole flax seeds and just see when they show up on the other end. It should be within
Mm.
24 hours. So
Okay,
if it's like
cool.
2 days later, it's like, probably got slow gastric emptying. But self tests, yay. So there's some things you can do. You can do some things that stimulate the migraine motor complex, the ginger extract being a really beautiful one for that. Um, but also the thyroid is the main metabolic regulator there. And so if that is like if it's depleted of nutrients, which are a downstream effect of stress, then it cannot do its job. Like I've got a client right now who's, her blood tests are off and she keeps going, they keep putting her on different medications and it's like it's not working well for her. And that's because she doesn't have any foundation to stand on. Like she's totally out of nutrients from history of stress from a couple stressful events she had the past couple of years because stress depletes all the nutrients. Then if you don't have any foundation for the thyroid to stand on, it's like all these processes are very nutrient dependent. Stomach acid, every freaking process is very nutrient dependent. So if you aren't digesting and absorbing nutrients, then eventually something else is going to go wrong eventually. So
Right.
the cool part is it's not a million different things. It's like you start to pull together a few things and everything else just starts to work again. So that's the good news. Okay. So, but relapse prevention, I spend a lot of time like optimizing thyroid with nutrients, subclinical thyroid, because if that is slow, you will have slow motility. And I call it the bird bath effect. Stagnant water in a bird bath is overgrowth. You will have more overgrowth
Mhm.
there. So
So
keep
that's
it
really
moving.
important. Like, I don't want people
Keep
to
it
miss
moving.
that. If you're having slow bowel motility, then that's an environment that promotes bacterial
Mm-hmm.
overgrowth.
Yes.
And the slow motility is often caused by a stress.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Okay,
stress,
stress.
sluggish thyroid, which
Um,
may not show up on blood work. And this is where it gets kind of frustrating for people, but that's okay. You can also stimulate your motility with migrating motor complex stuff. Also, your vagus nerve kind of gets atrophied with lots of stress. Like you've atrophied the rest and digest and parasympathetic. So there's a lot of things you can do to stimulate your vagus nerve as well. When I started using, because mine was very slow for a long time because I had all of the issues I talked about today. And so when I started using a vagus nerve stimulation device, I was like, oh, I do see that difference. Like it is so faint, but I can literally feel like my
mhm.
gut like pulsing like a little twinge
Interesting.
there. And literally it changed my mood and all kinds of things. It's kind of fascinating. Vagus nerve being the largest nerve that runs from like your head all the way through your gut, innervates everything. And so
That's so cool too. I've never heard anyone say it like that. Like, if you don't use it, you lose it. And if you're in
just like
chronic
a muscle.
stress, right, you're not using your parasympathetic, your rest and digest nervous system, like
It's
that
weak.
vagus nerve that's kind of that master nerve for that rest and digest side. Well, if you don't use it, you lose it. So you lose your ability to really rest and relax and digest.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that vagus nerve stimulation device that you just spoke of?
There's many actually.
Yeah.
And so I'll just mention the free things first. So there's a whole bunch of things like laying on your side and doing all these things and just being happy and dancing. I usually recommend to my clients doing like gargling or humming for 3+ minutes per day. Cause I think that like if I look at the list, I'm like, yeah, you're not gonna see a difference if you do just these few things. So let me give you something where it's like, like you're actually stimulating it. There's a handful of devices out there and I'll run through them. Nuvana Zen XEN was one I had. It's a little bit expensive, and you're not like the person who, if you like a man, stereotypically, they're not going to notice. Like, I would not put that on my husband, and he would not feel it.
Okay.
Like, I feel a little bit of a it's kind of like a really faint TENS unit, where it's like poking you. And you
Yeah.
can use a TENS unit and put it certain places. I'm not an expert on that.
Like needed 10 units in school. So those are like,
Oh yeah.
electrical stimulation devices.
Yeah.
I'm so sensitive to those.
Okay, yeah, you could totally use something like that and look up the directions to do that, if someone wanted to. Something really powerful that I got my mom, who has an autoimmune disease where like all of your swallowing is affected, is a Truvaga, Truvaga. Obviously, no one's giving us any money to talk about this. The problem with that $300 device was it had an expiration on the sessions, which was stupid. Then they came out recently
Oh,
with a
yeah.
$450 version one that was unlimited, which is about the same price as the Zen was when I bought it.
Mm.
I just saw a new one called Pulsetto, and it's kind of like a headband you put right here. So both the Truvaga and the Pulsetto require ultrasound gel, and you put them right here, and they're gonna
Okay.
really like your. That is one you can put on someone. It's like their face is gonna twitch, like it's gonna hit them. Like it's like basically a TENS unit essentially, specifically. So my people who are very disconnected, which just talking about stress, we're doers, and that's
Mhm.
very masculine. And we, in the Western world where we live, we get very disconnected from our body. And
Yeah.
all we're seeing is like, well, I'm bloated, but we're super disconnected to everything else. Like we're very unconscious of our stress because it's a survival mechanism. We're just going.
And then
So I care a lot about that topic. But for my people who are super disconnected, I'm going to recommend something that's like, they're going to be able to tell, like, this thing's going to zap you right here. It's going to stimulate your vagus nerve. And then there's one more I used to recommend a lot for people on autopilot. It was called Apollo Neuro.
yes.
And Dr. Elisa Song actually recommended it to me because she had a lot of pediatric patients using it. It just kind of looks like a little band, it doesn't have any digital stuff on it, but it kind of looks like a little band watchy thing. And you can take it off the band and put it in a pocket. You can wrap it around an ankle. It's got like an elasticy band, and that you sync up to your phone and you can put it on a program. And so it can literally run on autopilot. Whereas these other things, like you just need to remember to use it. And so the Pulsetto takes
Mhm.
like 4 minutes. The Truvaga takes a couple of minutes. The Nuvana Zen, you put it in the headphones and like it might take 20 minutes, but you could move around. Sensate, some people have seen Sensate. I don't know the exact mechanism, but it's like the size of a bar of soap and it vibrates on your chest, but you need to lay down, for
Oh,
that to
interesting. Okay.
function. And then Apollo Neuro. So the Apollo Neuro is kind of autopilot. So for my people who
Yeah.
literally this is a ton of people. Like they know that they're stressed, but they're like they don't feel like they can do anything about it. They're like, I don't have a choice. I have to run, run, run. I have this business. Like it's funny. I've had so many bakery owners, and this is the
Oh,
conversation.
really?
Yeah. And so I remember one of them said, like, wow, my bloating's better. My mood is better. My digestion's just better as she's wearing this thing. And it's like pulsing all day long, stimulating for her, doing it for her. So if someone's
Okay.
really struggling, they just don't feel like they can do anything, then that is like an autopilot device. Now it does run out of battery a lot faster because it's running hours a
Yeah.
day, but you can set up a program on your phone to just make it run and it'll just sit there and vibrate on you.
We can talk for so long, and I think that I love the mindset side of things, and I
Mm.
love learning more and more reasons to incorporate rest and relaxation into our day, and
Hmm.
improving your gut health and digestion is just one of them.
Hmm.
And I always like to say, it's great to exercise, and that works your, sympathetic, your fight and flight nervous system most of the time, depending on what you're doing. But we also want to exercise our parasympathetic nervous system as well. And that is something I'm actively working on, is incorporating more rest into my workday. So it's not like go, 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 go for
Oh,
like
I know.
6 hours while the kids are gone and I have the time. I can't do it
Hmm.
anymore. So I'm really enjoying incorporating what we're talking about. And more like sprints in my workday. So it's
Mm.
like go a little bit and then take a rest, and then go a little bit and then take a rest. And so for me, that's been really effective. But I love what you said, just straight up, like, perfectionists, if you're stressing yourself out, you're more likely to have gut issues,
Yeah.
just plain and simple.
Right.
So
And so then
learning a
we're just
little bit more
unlayering
about,
ourselves, right? We're just like
yeah, curious mindset is helpful.
getting to know yourself is going to be one. I think that a lot of stress is rooted in relationship, both with self and with others. And so the more we learn about our relationship with ourselves, the more it will affect our relationship. Because something that's been really cool, I pretty much just like live in continuing ed around mindset ish stuff right now. And
Love it.
so a really cool thing that I learned that I has been really life changing is that your relationship with someone else is just your thoughts about them. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that is true. Right. And so it's just been really transformational on just these little sneaky stressors, even in my family, right? Like how I'm interacting with my kids is like, oh, actually, if I want to improve this relationship or I want to be less stressed around it, It's up to me to change my thoughts about it, you know?
Yep.
The end.
And I know that you haven't probably listened to all the podcast episodes, but my regular listeners like, yes, now she's speaking Morgan's language because we talk about
Mhm.
thoughts all the time. So, Krista, can you let our listeners know where they can learn more about you and if they want to work with you, how they would do that?
Sure. So the easiest way to find me, if you're a podcast listener, is I also have a podcast. It's called The Less Stressed Life, which was a sneaky title that came when I wanted to talk about inflammation, but no one wanted to listen to about inflammation. So I just had smart people listening, and same people listen now. Doesn't matter what I
Yeah.
called it. So it's called The Less Stressed Life. I am anti-inflammatory nutritionist on Instagram, or you can just find me at christabiegler.com. All of the things are there, retreats, one-on-one work, etc.
Awesome. Well, it was so nice to connect with you today. Thanks for letting us pick your brain on
Yeah.
SIBO and all the things related to gut health and digestion. And I hope that people found this interview valuable. If you did, let us know in the comments if you're watching on YouTube what you like the most about this interview. Share it with a friend. Give it a thumbs up. That way more people can see it. Thank
Thanks so
you.
much, Morgan.